See my screen, can you? Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. My name is Monifa Johnson, and I am glad to have the opportunity to be able to work with you today. I would love to begin by sharing what our agenda is, and then we'll move through that agenda. So, there is a part one and a part two to today's session. Part one is from 9:05 to about 10 o'clock, and that will cover the selected response part of the assessment. And then part two will take us from about 10:10 to 11 o'clock, and that will cover the constructed response side. So, our agenda to open, I would love to know your expectations for this session. I want to share the objectives for the session, talk about our norms, give an overview of the test. I do want us to spend most of our time during this first hour in practicing some selected response questions, and then we'll close with some study tips, some things to keep in mind, and reflections or takeaways. Closing meaning closing out part one before we shift into constructed response. So, what are your expectations? You can drop those things in the chat. You can come off mute and share them. What do you expect from today's session? Don't be shy. Rachel, it looks like you might be talking, but you're on mute. Let me see if I see anything in the chat. Okay. Best ways to study, types of questions. Okay. Feeling comfortable, strategies. Okay. How to correctly answer the constructed responses. And then I also see to get a general idea of what is covered on the exam. All right. Figuring out strategies, been missing by about 2 points. Okay. Anybody else have something you want to join in and add to the chat, or you can come off mute? All right, so it looks like that might be it. So I am hoping to meet your expectations. Let me scroll back through. We will talk about some study strategies, some study tips. We will be talking about the layout of the test. We will address how to respond to constructed responses. So I think that your expectations will be met on today, but you always, as you'll see in the norm, you always have an opportunity to jump in and ask a question if you feel that what you're looking for you're not receiving. Please make sure to speak up and say something. So let us continue. Thanks for sharing those expectations. So, objectives, this is what I'd like to offer for you today. I want us to practice, and this is what you're looking for as well, practice with sample test questions, not only selected response, but also constructed response, and for us to have an opportunity to reflect on what worked or what didn't work when approaching those test questions. Norms, I'd like you to engage, whether that's in the chat or whether that is coming off mute and sharing your voice. But while you are expected to engage, I also want you to share the airtime. So we'd like to hear all the voices. We'd like to hear from everybody that is actually a part of this session. Third, if you're wondering about something, ask. Don't keep it to yourself. You can put your question in the chat. You can come off mute and share. But if you are wondering, ask. And last, if somebody shares something that you disagree with, just make sure that you disagree with the idea and not the person. So it's okay to say you disagree, just make sure it's with the idea. Any questions so far? All right. So, an overview of the test or the test at a glance, the teaching reading elementary test is 150 minutes. It's broken up into 90 selected response questions and 3 constructed response questions. So, if we just think about the timing and think about what we're expected to do during that time period, the selected response is supposed to take about 1 minute per question as you're responding. And then the constructed response is supposed to be about 10 minutes per question. So you really be spending about 2 hours or 120 minutes on the selected response. And then 30 minutes on the constructed response because each of those should take about 10 minutes. Now, content that's covered during the assessment. First, you see phonological and phonemic awareness, including emergent literacy. So you'd expect about 13 questions there, and that's about 11% of the test. Second, the content is focused on phonics and decoding. You would expect about 18 questions there, and that's about 15% of the test. Third, the test would focus on vocabulary and fluency. You'd expect about 21 questions there, and that's about 18% of the test. Then we have comprehension of literary and informational text. That's about 22 questions and about 18% of the test as well. And then there's writing, which is about 15 questions and 13% of the test. The last section, assessment of instructional decision making, that's the constructed response where you'd be looking at those three questions that would take about 30 minutes, 10 minutes each, and that's 25% of the test. So that answers that what is on the test question that we had as far as expectations go. Now, some more things to keep in mind or to know about the Praxis 5205. It does focus on the knowledge and skills to support reading and writing development in students. And the items do provide some sort of context so that we can apply that to whatever topics and terms we're hearing. So we might not always be familiar with every topic, we might not always be familiar with every term, but we do get some kind of context from the questions that may help us to answer those questions well. So let's go ahead and get into actually practicing. So that first section that we're going to practice is phonological and phonemic awareness. So again, you get about 13 items of questions that look like these, and that's about 11% of the test. Since we're supposed to take about 1 minute to respond to the questions, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to answer questions 17 and 5 in the chat. I want to give you about 2 minutes, maybe 2.5 minutes to answer and put your responses in the chat, and then we will begin to discuss. So, 2 minutes. Let's get started. I'm setting my timer on my phone. That's why I'm looking down. All right, the answers are rolling in. Okay. So we have a few seconds left for those of us that didn't get a chance to respond. You can go ahead and put your answers in the chat. And for the most part, just in scrolling, it looks like we're choosing D for both, for 17 and for 5 is what it looks like. So let's go ahead and get started. Who would like to remember? I'd like you to engage. So, who would like to come off mute and share with us why you chose D for 17? How did you work through that question? What came to mind for you?
For me, for number 17 is asking for pronouncing a sound.
Mhm.
And so when I thought of sound, I thought of phoneme.
Okay. Okay, good response for that. Anybody else have a different approach to number 17 and why you may have chosen D? It looks like everybody chose D.
I chose 17 because phoneme segmentation, well, phoneme does have to do with sounds, but the segmentation has to do with the individual sounds in the word. And so by asking what the G or where the G sound is, that has to do with phoneme segmentation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't look like we had any issues with number 17. So we can go ahead and move on to number 5. But if you do have a question, make sure you ask. But let's look at number 5. Again, I noticed for this one, most of us chose D as well. So let's look at that question. Which of the following is the best way for a teacher to assess students' phonological awareness? And most of us chose D, displaying the written word cat and asking students to sound it out as they tap each letter. So tell me a little bit about the thought process, somebody for number 5. Why do we choose D?
Well, I chose D because phonological awareness has to do with the written um, relationship between the sounds and the letters. And so to me, that was the best choice because C was saying to distribute the letter cards B, A, and T and asking the students to order the letters to create a word, but it
Mhm.
never really identified what the actual word was. But indeed, it says displaying the written word cat and then asking the students to sound it out as they tap each letter. So that's identifying each sound in that written word.
Okay. So one of the things that I heard you say, and I'm going to ask for some feedback from the group. I see a slowdown, so let me slow down. I will ask for some feedback from the group. But what I heard was in hearing or seeing the phonological awareness, we were thinking about the written letters. So, question to the group, is phonological awareness about the written letters? And you can put a response in the chat as well, unless you want to come off mute.
Doesn't it
Yes.
all, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. It,
I was just thinking when you asked that question, doesn't it all fall under phonological awareness? Is part of it, the written aspect of it as well?
So, the written aspect would be considered phonics. The phonological and phonemic awareness is more oral. The phonics is where we're translating sound to letters. So when we
Okay.
think about that, would D be the best response? And I will also share with you what the test makers say as far as their explanation. But when we think about that, would D displaying the written word be a good choice if we know that phonological awareness is relating to oral language or sound and not the written?
So would it end up being B then? Because it's asking the student to identify the letter at the beginning of a word, which they
So,
would then tell the sound.
so if they're identifying a letter, again, they're looking at something that's written. The best choice in this one is actually going to be A. And let's look at why the answer is A after we read the choice. So it says saying the word lamp and asking students to come up with rhyming words. So all of that has to do with something that's not written. It's just about awareness of sound. So let me show you what the test makers actually say for question number 5, where the best response is A. So they say phonological awareness refers to the recognition that words are comprised of sound units or phonemes and can be broken down into syllables. Choices B, C, and D are incorrect because a phonemic awareness assessment focuses on identification of the skills of phoneme matching, isolation, blending, and segmentation. So, again, we're still dealing with sound. And so, when we look at all the choices, the one choice that deals with sound and not letters or anything written is going to be A. So, yes, Elizabeth, A would be the best answer. Is this something you think we need to explore more? Or are we ready to move on to the next section? So before we move on, I do have a question that I would like to ask that I think is related to the conversation that we just had. And these questions do come from the study companion. I didn't make it up, but I would like to ask, how is phonemic awareness related to phonological awareness? How is phonemic awareness related to phonological awareness? Who'd like to put something in a chat or come off mute and share?
Is it because phonemes have to do with sounds and phonological awareness? When you understand the sounds, you're able to say it?
That's connected to it. So they're both related to sound. And does anybody else want to add something before I continue? And when I continue, I'm going to give you the Google answer, not the Monifa Johnson answer. Anybody have something they'd like to add to that? Okay, so here's the Google answer. Phonological awareness is about identifying and manipulating units of sound. So, words or syllables or onset and rhyme, looking at units of sound. Phonemic awareness is the ability to identify and manipulate individual sounds. So, just like that question where the question that we had, number 17, where the teacher was asking where the sound G was in fog, that would be a phoneme, individual sound, but phonological awareness is a unit of sound, so it could be more than one letter. All right, any questions there? All right, remember, I want you to engage, and if you have a question, I definitely want you to ask. Here are two questions related to writing. Remember, writing will be about 15 items that will look like these and about 13% of your test. So we have two questions. I'd like to give you about 2 minutes to respond and answer in the chat. And you are also welcome to answer by coming off mute. Let me give you your 2 minutes. Okay, I see some responses coming in so far, looking like B and B. Let's take about 10 more seconds. Okay, I'd love to have someone either, okay, A and B, I see it. So B and B, A and B. And everybody who didn't get a chance to respond, be sure to put something in the chat. And again, you're welcome to come off mute. I'd love to hear for number 16, the response. So why did you choose B? Or why did you choose A for number 16? Anybody?
I chose B because it says the phrase that eliminates wordiness and redundancy. When you look at their examples, you can see that they kind of combine both of them, which made me realize that, it was eliminating redundancy in the end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. What about A? I also saw an A for number 16. Can we get an explanation for that? What was your thought process?
I thought it was A because I think there were complete sentences. I mean, it has everything that A had.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I put like that face going, because I wasn't sure.
Okay.
To me, it looked right to me.
Okay. I get it. Let's go back to the question. So they, of course, give us examples, example one and example two. And then the question says a teacher engages students in a discussion of how the two sentences in each of the preceding examples are combined into one. So maybe a first clue when we're thinking about how the sentences are being combined, maybe a first clue for choice B is that it does, like Elizabeth said, eliminate wordiness and redundancy by combining. So that might be a clue. But let's go back to the question. The teacher's goal can be identified as providing instruction in which of the following rules of grammar. So when we look at the sentences that are combined, and choice A does say complete sentence, there's a subject, there's a verb, there's a standalone idea. It's true that we can see that there's a subject and a verb, and there's an idea for those when the sentences are combined. But the best choice is actually going to be B, and we'll look at why the test maker said so. But what you'll notice is when you're looking at these questions or looking at the examples where everything is combined, let's look at the second example. Miss Tyler, comma, Sally's favorite teacher, comma, is kind and always fair to everyone in class. So we can see that there's wordiness that we don't have anymore. There were some words that were eliminated, but also that Sally's favorite teacher is referring back to Miss Tyler, and that would be in a positive, of referring back to what comes right before that. So Sally's favorite teacher is in a positive for Miss Tyler. And if we look for that in that other example, example number one, Dylan ate lunch at Joe's Pizzeria, comma, his favorite restaurant to go to on weekends. The his favorite restaurant refers back to Joe's Pizzeria, and that's what makes it an a positive. It's modifying the noun that came before it, but then it's also by combining those two sentences, it's eliminating wordiness and redundancy. So I would like us to look at how that's being explained when we look at what the test makers had to say for number 16. And if you have a question or a comment, please be sure to jump off mute or put it in the chat. So it says the correct answer is B. In the combined sentence in each example, and a positive is used as a modifier, thereby reducing the repetition and wordiness of the two short sentences. Choice A is incorrect because all sentences in the examples are complete sentences. And if you have something you'd like to share, please be sure to do that. But I am going to go back to hear what you had to say about choice number or item number 22, where it looks like everybody chose B for number 22. I'd love to hear an explanation.
So when you think about credibility in writing, you're always wanting to evaluate where the sources come from, what type of website, who created the website, and the validity of what they are choosing to present in those sources. And so when you are looking for credible or primary resources while you're doing like some type of writing, you're always supposed to evaluate those sources to see how is it relevant to whatever topic it is that you're writing, and is it accurate based on who's writing it. Like we always learn that Wikipedia isn't a credible source because it can always be edited. And so like websites like .org or like .net or .edu are those really credible websites to use. And so that's why I chose B.
Okay. Anybody have something to add to that or a response to that? B is going to be our best choice. And let's look at what the test makers had to say about that. So it does say the correct answer is B. Students must determine who created the website and whether it gives them useful and accurate information before they can use the source as an effective means of research. So that was an excellent response, Erin. If you have a question, again, put it in the chat or come off mute, but we are going to continue. But I would like to ask one of the discussion questions for this section from the companion. So for writing, how does writing support reading development? This test is focused on teaching reading for elementary students, but there's a section on writing. How does writing support reading development?
The first thing that came to my mind was like expressive and receptive learning. So, you know that those two go hand in hand. And in order to write, it's important that you understand reading and vice versa. So I think that's why they go hand in hand like that.
Okay. Okay. Let's
I
hear.
also think it improves their fluency, their reading fluency when they write more.
Say a little bit more about that, about the fluency related to the writing.
So when students have to like think about spelling patterns or things like that when they write, if it becomes more natural to them when they write, when they don't, it becomes second nature for them to think about those things when they're reading, so they begin reading more fluently.
Okay. Anybody else want to join in?
I also think with reading, in order to be able to produce some form of a sentence or writing, you have to know how to accurately string those words together in order to make it cohesive and make it make sense. So anybody can write a sentence, but you have to really have that, I can't find the word. You have to know how to put words together in order for it to translate and make sense.
And I will share a Google response. So, of course, it's not the answer, but it is a response. So, writing can improve comprehension, which is something that I've heard all three of you actually say. When students are writing about text that they've read, it's helpful for them to also understand what they've read. And then when they're learning writing skills, like maybe about the positive question that we just explored. So when they're learning writing skills and processes that go into creating a text, it also helps to support their comprehension as well. Okay, let us move into another set of questions. This one is related to phonics and decoding. So you see about 18 items that look like this. It's about 15% of your test. And I'd like you to take 2 minutes to read these questions and respond in the chat. Thank you. Okay, so I'm seeing the responses roll in. It looks like mostly B for number 14. Okay, I do see some D, so B or D for 14. And then for 13, I'm seeing A, C, B, and C. Okay, C again. So let's go ahead. Let's start with number 14, where it looks like it's mostly B. And then I do see a D, or two Ds. So let's look at number 14. Who would like to share your response? Why do you think it's either B or D? Aaron, it looks like you might be talking, but you're on mute.
You said it looks like I'm talking?
I just see the green around your name, so I was wondering if you were trying to say something.
Oh,
Okay.
no, I'm sorry. I was on mute. I mean,
Okay.
I can. So I chose B. I, the responses or selection of responses was kind of tricky to me, but I did choose B because a word wall wouldn't really help in a multi-syllabic word, because if they are having they're struggling to decode them, looking at them wouldn't help. They need to know the phonics behind the relationships of the letters. So and then working together in a group and taking turns reading aloud, that still wouldn't help either, because you can't read words that you don't know.
Mhm.
And I kind of did process of elimination. And D, no, I already went over D. And C, demonstrating for parents how to engage in partner reading at home. I mean, that may help, but it's not really teaching them how to decode those words. And so the only choice to me that made sense was to organize level word study groups and provide word sorts and classification activities, so you would be able to separate some of the syllables in those words and break those down and decode them better by just knowing what certain syllables make in groups of letters.
Mhm. Mhm. All right, can we get another response?
I was thinking for number 14 when it said multisyllabic words,
Mhm.
dividing those words up into syllables. So creating a word sort or some type of um like word wall that kind of differentiates those words from each other based upon their syllable. That's what
Okay.
made me for
Okay.
14.
All right. Anybody
I
else?
picked D. I'm sorry.
Yes, go
Uh,
ahead.
I picked D2 because illustrated word walls are more visual
Mhm.
for the visual learners. And I think breaking the word down and actually seeing it being broken down will help struggling readers.
Okay. And I can see why, in hearing those explanations, I can see why you chose D, but I'm wondering if we read the choice in its entirety when we're looking at D. So it does say creating an illustrated word wall, but the ending says that focuses students' attention on common sight words. So the question is about struggling to decode multisyllabic words, and there may be some sight words that are multisyllabic, but choice D focuses on common sight words and not necessarily putting us in a position to decode the multisyllabic words. So let's look at what the test makers had to say for that. So number 14. Did somebody come off mute? Okay, so number 14, the correct answer is B. Organizing leveled word study groups can provide struggling students with decoding multisyllabic words with sorting and classifying activities based on common patterns and rules. And let's look at what it says for choice D. Choice D is incorrect because although a word wall will support students with word study, these students need practice chunking syllables, not memorizing sight words. Now let's go back and let's think about the next question. Number 13, the next question. And we did have a variety of responses here. So I'd love to get to hear from maybe each one. So I see a C, I see a B. I'd like to hear what your thoughts were for question number 13.
I chose C because the question asks about concepts of print for kindergarten students.
Mhm.
With the option C, it talks about modeling the organization of large print picture books, like during read alouds. So the first thing, the way how like I interpreted the question was, how do children read? Like, do they know how to read from left to right? Do they know which way to hold the book? And I thought of modeling that so that way they would understand, all the basic things when it comes to print.
Okay. Can I hear the thought process behind B? There's an A as well. So maybe the thought process behind B or A.
I chose A because beginning, especially in kindergarten, beginning to learn sight words are how you are able to begin to read. And so by teaching sight words in isolation, so like at or the or my or I, that'll start to improve their high frequency words and sight words. So they'll be able to read at a smaller, smaller words in print than
Mhm.
actually having to be able to decode because they're still learning the sounds fluently for the alphabet. And so that's why I chose A.
Okay. Anybody else?
For number 13, of course, I chose C because for kindergartens, I feel like you always have to model what you're presenting first. And so that pretty much stood out to me.
Okay. Okay. So let's go on and look at what the test makers had to say about this one. Which of the following activities will best support the understanding of concepts of print? Concepts of print in kindergarten students. So it says here, I'm sorry, let me back up. The correct answer is C. The shared reading approach using large print picture books helps kindergarten students develop awareness of concepts of print. And then let's go to some of the other choices. So I saw choice A. Choice A is incorrect because teaching students to recognize sight words in isolation is a decoding skill. So A is about decoding, and C is about developing awareness of concepts of print. And then we also had some that thought the best choice might have been B. Choice B is incorrect because students who can read independently using large print picture books have moved beyond development of concepts of print and are reading. So, what are some ideas or what things come to mind for you? So, we had some that thought that maybe utilizing the sight words would be best. Others having the kids read on their own would be best. What are your thoughts now that you see the best response to this question and the rationale for that?
I really like the one person that said about modeling, having this teacher model. So that kind of changed my answer from B to C when she was talking about that.
Okay. Anybody else have something that came to mind for you? You heard other people's explanations, you see what the test makers had to say. How did that shift your thinking?
It shifts my thinking when thinking about how I teach when we do the I do, you do, we do, modeling everything and making sure you're modeling it correctly. So it just more so pushes me more to be very intentional when I'm teaching that I'm actually, responding to the deficit of concepts of print because that is a deficit right now in kinder.
All right, thank you. Now, I do have a question that I'd like to ask related to this section. So this is the phonics and decoding section. I have a discussion question from the study companion. What is the difference between phonics and phonological awareness? What is the difference between phonics and phonological awareness?
So we discussed earlier that phonological awareness was being able to put units of sounds together and understanding how to manipulate them. Phonics is, if I remember correctly, the relationship between sounds and letters. So understanding like if two like digraphs and things like that. So if two letters are together, you understand how it's pronounced differently than if it's in another word, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. All right. Another response or a connection to what Elizabeth had to say? Okay, so let me share the Google response. It's not the answer, it's just something to think about. So, phonics is the mapping of speech sounds or phonemes to letters or letter patterns. This is what Elizabeth talked about. And phonological awareness, which we discussed earlier, is about identifying and manipulating those units of oral language. So, things like words and syllables and onset and rhyme. The next section that we will give you an opportunity to answer questions for is vocabulary and fluency. You can expect about 21 items on your test, and that's about 18% of your test. I want to give you at this time 2 minutes to respond to these two questions. Okay, so that's been about 2 minutes. I am starting to see some responses come in. So, our first question so far, a couple of different responses. So I'm seeing D, B, and C for number 3. I'm seeing A, so it looks like one that we really want to make sure that we spend some time on. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Can I have one person just share what was you thinking? Why did you choose what you chose?
Well, on 13, I originally chose B, but now that I'm looking at the answer choices a little better, B would be my answer because I know that conjugates has to do with like the relationship or like similarities to a word in a native language. And when I first glanced through the answer choices, B was the only one that talked about native languages, so that's the one I chose. But
Okay.
D is, to me, is the better choice because it's asking students to raise their hand when they encounter a word that shares a similar meaning, spelling, or pronunciation with a word from their native language, which is more of the definition of what a conjugate is. And so that, I guess I changed my answer from B to D.
Okay. Okay. And thank you for that. That was a great explanation. Anybody else? Do we have one other person?
I think D really, I mean, it focuses on cooperative learning amongst the students, and then with cognitives, it focuses on the linguistics. I think I'm saying it correctly. I'm not sure. Linguistics
I
of the
maybe linguistics.
linguistics. I'm sorry,
Okay.
amongst the children in their native language. So that's what made me pick D.
Okay. All right, and D is the best response. I love that explanation for why one of us moved from B to D. But let's look at what the test makers had to say about why it is D and not any of the other choices. So it says this strategy refers to recognizing cognates that share similar meaning, spelling, or pronunciation with words from one's native language. So I think one of our responses was A. A is incorrect because this strategy refers to training students to use context clues to understand the meaning of unknown words. So that might be a useful strategy, but it's not referring to cognates. And then B, as we heard explained, is incorrect because this refers to students applying scanning techniques and comparing the text to the native language, but it does not address the cognates. And then C would be incorrect because this strategy refers to the teacher using realia in the class to teach new or difficult vocabulary and context. And that might be useful, but it doesn't relate to or refer to cognates. So D is our best response for that. Now let's go back and let's pick up with our next question. So this one, I think I see maybe C's and D's. I do see one A, C's and D's for this one. Can I get one explanation?
I'm not sure if I'm correct. I kind of used a lovely educational guess. But I think that annotation has to do with speaking,
Mhm.
that I wasn't sure of. But the only ones that I noticed that talked about speaking were A and C. And I think that if they're imitating voices that they heard from recordings, it's not really that beneficial to them because
Mhm.
then they can just be copying what they've heard. So I think C is a more, I don't know, engaged practice that they could do. And that way, since they're with the peer, they could also provide input or, any type of support for their peer while they're reading.
Okay, so that was definitely a good explanation of your thinking. Let's go ahead and move into what the test makers have to say. And then, time wise, we'll go ahead and take a 10-minute break and then we'll just come back and finish part one and move into part two. So, which of the following strategies will best support first grade students who are learning to use intonation to improve their reading fluency? So, they're learning to use intonation to improve their reading fluency. I kind of want you to think about modeling as we read what the test makers have to say about this question. Okay, the correct answer is A, asking students to match their intonation to an audio recorded reading of the same text is a research based recommended strategy. Choice B would be incorrect because first grade students are too young to calculate word per minute and set realistic goals, but it would be a good activity with teacher support. Choice C is incorrect because new text should always be read independently or with a teacher, and having students tackle the new reads together will not guarantee that they develop proper intonation. And choice D is incorrect because although tracking with the finger is helpful when practicing fluency, it doesn't necessarily support them in developing proper intonation. So the rise and fall of voices that might be associated with fluency, that ability to read with expression, one thing that would help them is if they're learning that, is to hear a model of that. And that's where that audio recorded comes in. Any comments there or questions there? Anybody have a shift in their thinking after hearing the response to or the analysis of why we choose A?
I do. I think it goes back to what I think somebody was saying earlier about why it's so important to model. And yeah, it definitely makes sense.
Okay. Well, time wise, we want to go ahead and take a break. We did not finish section one, but we can pick that up in about 10 minutes. So I'm going to turn off my camera for about 10 minutes and we are going to take our break. And when we come back, we'll finish up part one, which is just one more section with 2 questions, and then we'll move into constructed response. Is that okay with everybody?
Yes.
All
Yes,
right. Well, I will
absolutely.
see you in 10 minutes. All right, everyone, we are starting back up. We're finishing part one, dealing with the selected response, and then we will transition into constructed response. So, our last 2 questions come from the section of the test built around comprehension of literary and informational text. So, on this part of the test, you'd expect about 22 items, and that would be about 18% of your test. So we have 2 questions here that are related to comprehension of literary and informational text. I'd like you to take 2 minutes to respond to the questions and put your answers in the chat. What do you think those answers are for number 1 and number 6? 2 minutes. All right, so it looks like for number 1, we have mostly, let me stop that alarm. So mostly C for number 1. I did see an A, and then it looks like mostly D for number 6. I do see a B as well. So let's go ahead and get started with number 1. Share your thinking. Why did you choose what you chose?
When I was thinking of a response journal, I'm thinking it's allowing the students an opportunity to think about, what they've read. So that's why I chose C.
Okay.
I think I was going back and forth on A and C. I ended up on A because reading fluency, I think, goes hand in hand with comprehension. And if they're responding to it, they have to understand the text. But I could go either way with those two ones.
Okay. So if they're say that last part again, if they are responding to it, what did you say?
If they're responding to the text, my sense of thinking was they would have to understand the text, so they'd have to comprehend it, which
Okay.
helps with reading fluency.
Okay. And it really sounds like in your explanation of why you chose A, it sounds like you're actually explaining C. But let's go ahead and look at what the test makers had to say about that. For question number one, the best answer is C. Response journals offer students an opportunity to connect their lives to the text and also to deepen their understanding. And then it says none of the choices except C describe the teacher's purpose of using a reading response journal. So when the students are filling out or completing a response journal, it's about their reaction to the text, which goes back to C, help students discover more of what they think and feel about the text. So again, Elizabeth, how you were explaining A, it still really sounded like you were explaining the choice C. Does anybody else have a comment about question number one or something that came to mind for you in looking at what your peers had to say and looking at what the test maker said? All right, let's go to six. Let's go to six. So most of the responses are D. I did see one or more B for number six. So let's look at it. Administering an informal reading inventory best assesses a student in which of the following areas? I'd love to hear two responses for number six.
I chose D because it's informal. So it's not really testing to see how a student is doing with their fluency or anything like that. And then it's looking at the inventory. So what the student has read in the past, what they enjoy. So I think it's D because it's looking at like what the student chooses when they're able to choose a book to read.
Okay. Okay. So we heard an explanation for A. Can we get another? I mean, not A, for D. Can we get another?
I also chose D because it says reading inventory. So when I think of like an inventory, I think of like the teacher's trying to like figure out what the student enjoys and like reading. So that's why I chose D.
Okay. So we will look at what the test makers had to say. But when we're looking at that, I want you to think about an informal reading inventory being not an inventory of what students have read in the past or what they prefer to read, but an inventory of their skill. Think about that, an inventory of their reading skill, their reading ability. So let's look at that response for number six. Okay, the correct answer is B. An informal reading inventory is designed to evaluate a number of aspects of students' reading performance, including reading level, by assessing students' comprehension of leveled passages. So, an informal reading inventory is looking at their comprehension of leveled passages, which goes back to students' actual skill in reading. Now let's look at D. D is incorrect because the primary focus of the inventory is to determine their reading level, not their reading preferences. But I do think the explanation of why you thought the inventory might refer to their preferences or something they've read in the past, I can hear that. What you want to do now is connect an informal reading inventory to where students are in their reading skill. That's what you're inventorying. Okay, and I think I made up a word with the inventorying. Does anybody have a response to that, or something that you were helped by hearing how your peers are thinking? You were helped by listening to this response from the test makers. What feedback do you have on that item? Most of us did choose D for that.
I think the frustrating part for me, it's like you have two answers that could be right, but you have to pick one that's the perfect one. And during this whole process, I've been stuck with that. And it's like, I think it's the right answer, but then there's another answer that's the perfect one. And that's the thing that's frustrating me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's
And
where
you
I
have somebody agreeing, saying yes.
am.
So what
And
do
I
you
also would add
go ahead?
that for the reason I picked D because I'm thinking about a variety because I'm looking at the word inventory and I look at inventory, I know it's speaking about more than one. But also too now after looking at what the test creator said, it does make me think about, oh, when I say informal assessments, when I think of assessments, I should have knew that, oh, like a progress monitoring or instructional reading level, because I'm assessing how well you're doing. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I got tricked up on that one.
Okay, but that was a great connection. So going back to that word assesses and using that to help figure out that the best response is going to be instructional reading level. So that was a good response. Anybody else?
I chose D as well, but now, like after we had a discussion about it, and now that I was thinking about it, I remember in one of my classes actually having to do a reading inventory, and I'm not sure why I chose D when all of it was like a monster spelling test, and
Mm-hmm.
it was a whole bunch of other. I don't know what I was thinking about when I chose that, but B does make more sense now that I'm thinking about the inventory that I actually conducted and what it consisted of, and
Mm-hmm.
seeing like how they're spelling and what words are that they know in their vocabulary and tiers of vocabulary, and understanding what their reading level would actually be.
Okay. Now, one thing that might help, maybe if you think about the overall purpose of the test, how this test is about supporting students in their reading and writing development. Maybe when you're really trying to get down to the last two answers and you're trying to figure out which one is going to be the best response, maybe if you go back to which of these would really support students in their reading or writing development, that might help you settle on what is actually the best answer. So that's a strategy to think about and maybe try as you are presented with other questions while you're practicing and you get down to those last two. Which of these would best support students' reading and writing development? I would like to close this section with a question related to comprehension of literary and informational text. So, again, a discussion question that came from the study companion. What is metacognition and why is it important for strategic reading? What is metacognition? Why is it important for strategic reading?
Is that like higher order thinking or thinking with details? And I think that would help with what was the second part of your question?
Just why is it important for strategic reading? Why is metacognition important for strategic reading?
When it comes to strategic reading, I think that I thought of like think alouds, and like you're asking them these questions so they can think deeper about the text that's being read. So
Mhm.
that was my initial thought.
Okay. Now, metacognition is thinking about your thinking. That's metacognition, thinking about thinking. Can I hear another response? What is metacognition? Even though I just said it again. Okay. And why is it important for strategic reading?
With metacognition, you're aware of your thought process. So for the strategic part of it, I guess it kind of helps you get through that because you understand your thought process. I'm not sure.
Okay. Okay. You are digging into your thought process. Now, let me go ahead and share our Google answer. Metacognition is thinking about our thinking. If students think about their thinking as they read, they can monitor their comprehension of text and fix it when it breaks down. So they may realize, hey, I need to stop. I need to go back. I need to reread. Maybe I need to use context clues because it's this word that's throwing me off. But when they're thinking about their thinking while they're reading, they can monitor their understanding and figure out when that understanding is faltering and try to find some way to fix or adjust their comprehension. All right, any closing comments on this section? We're closing, getting ready to close out of part one. Anything you want to share before we move on? Okay, some of the feedback when I asked a little bit earlier about what it was that you were hoping to get out of this session, one person did say ways to study. So here are some things to think about as you are continuing to study for this assessment. Spaced practice is one of the study tips. You want to spread out your practice opportunities. So you don't want to try to get everything done in a few days or a week. You want to spread it out. Self quiz. You can make up your own test questions, or you might use flashcards as a means of self quizzing. Active recall is another study tip. This is where you take a topic. You might just take one of the topics that's a content category for the test and write down everything that you know about the topic. And then you can look at what you've written and determine whether or not there are gaps in your understanding, gaps in your knowledge, things that you need to fill in, or whether you are really comfortable with that topic. So, active recall is a good study tip. Another study tip is to mix it up. So, don't just focus on one aspect of the text, not text, but the test. You want to mix up the topics. Okay, that's going to support you in your studying. And another tip is to just make it concrete. If there is an image that you can associate with a term or with a topic, or if there are examples that you can come up with or find that will help make these concepts concrete, you want to do that. Overall, though, you want to figure out what works best for you. And that kind of brings me back to the idea of metacognition, thinking about your thinking. As you're approaching these test questions, think about how you are going through the process of figuring out what you think is the best answer and whether or not there are any adjustments that you might need to make as it relates to that. Some things to keep in mind as you're also answering the selected response, there is no penalty for an incorrect answer. So guess. You might get it right. You might get credit for that response. There's no penalty. You will only get credit for what you have answered correctly. And guessing might help you answer something correctly. So don't be afraid to answer. The other thing to keep in mind is you can answer the questions in any order. So if you're stumped on a question, instead of spending a lot of time focusing on that one question, go on to something that you can answer and you can save that question for later and come back. You don't want to skip it completely. You do want to answer it because your guess might even be accurate, but answer the questions in any order that you feel most comfortable with. And I think that relates to one person did say they wanted to feel more comfortable taking the test. You might feel more comfortable if you answer the questions you know first. And so, as we get ready to close out on this section, I'm going to ask maybe one or two of us if you will just share your reflections or your takeaways from what we just did with the selected response and going through and discussing. What are your reflections or takeaways, things that are going to help you as you continue to prepare for this test?
One of my takeaways would be just paying very attention to the economy of language that they are using in the question. Like I think for the last one we did with assess, if I would have looked at assess, I would have knew that just put my mind towards progress monitoring or testing or to see where the students are. So just being very intentional of when I'm reading and paying attention to the language they are using.
Okay. Paying attention to that language in the chat. I see. I really like being able to practice a couple of questions from each section. It helped me understand the types of questions to expect. Does anybody else have a reflection or a takeaway?
For me, when it comes to early childhood education, I just feel like you have to pick the best response in relation to them. Just looking at the answers that are provided, for me, it would be just, picking the best answer that goes hand in hand with early childhood education.
Okay. So keeping an early childhood in mind is helpful for you. Like look, paying attention to the language is helpful for somebody else. And then just practicing,
Yeah.
more practice with the questions was helpful for another person. All right. So let us move ahead into the constructed response. This was our break slide, but we have already taken our break. So for part two, focusing on constructed response, I would like to start with an overview. I'd like to talk about some things to keep in mind, go over the general scoring guide, and then I'd like us to look at some sample responses and analyze them. And I'd like to close with us having an opportunity to practice constructed response ourselves. So let us move forward. Constructed response questions. Okay. So the teaching reading test consists of 3 questions. And remember, you probably want to spend about 30 minutes in this section, about 10 minutes on each question. The questions do require candidates to demonstrate the ability to apply knowledge and theory of reading to specific students' needs and classroom scenarios, and each task is scored on a 0 to 3 scale. Some things to keep in mind when responding to a constructed response: definitely want to answer the question accurately. You want to answer the question completely. You want to answer the question that is asked. Sometimes we make up our own question. Answer the question that is asked. We want to give a thorough and detailed response. And then you want to reread your response to make sure that you've done all of the other 4 things. You answered accurately, you answered completely, you answered what was asked, and your response is thorough and detailed. So you do want to check that as well. Now let's talk about the general scoring guide. If you pull the study companion, they format the rubric in a different way, but I just wanted to format it here for us in a way where we could easily see what makes a 3, 2, 1, and a 0 different. So looking at that first part, elements of reading and reading instruction that are relevant to the question, somebody who scores at a level 3 would show that they have a thorough understanding of the elements of reading and reading instruction, and their understanding that they're showing is also relevant to the question. But somebody who scores a 2 would show that their understanding of the elements of reading and reading instruction is basic or general. Somebody who scores a 1, their understanding would be weak or limited. And then somebody who scores a 0 would show that they have no understanding of the elements of reading and reading instruction. As far as answering the question, just answering the question, a person who scores a 3 would clearly and specifically answer all the parts of the question. Somebody who scores a 2 would adequately answer most or all of the question. Somebody who scores a 1 would answer some part. So they're leaving something out. They're answering some part, but then they're answering it at a basic level. And somebody who scores a 0 would just fail to respond appropriately to any part of the task. Relevant knowledge of concepts, theories, facts, procedures, or methodologies. Somebody who's in a 3 area would show strong knowledge. They might have minor errors. They may misuse a term, but they are showing strong knowledge. Somebody who's at a 2 level, again, would show basic or general knowledge. And they may make some errors too, but those errors don't detract from what they're trying to say. Somebody who scores a 1 would show weak or limited knowledge, or they would show that they really have some misconceptions, some things that they don't understand about reading and reading instruction. And somebody who scores a 0 would show no knowledge, or their knowledge is seriously in error. And then last, we'll look at explanations. Someone who scores a 3, their explanation, I'm sorry, let me go back. Their explanation would be strong and well supported. Someone who scores a 2, their explanations would be basic and adequately supported. And a 1 would have no explanation, a weak explanation, and inadequate support. So moving on to our next slide. Here is an example. Again, this comes from a study companion, but this is an example of a constructed response question. Now, this question really has 2 tasks associated with it, but for the purposes that we have for today, we're just going to focus on task number 1. Next week, those of us that come back will focus on task number 2. But this is our example of a constructed response question. Do I have anybody who'll be willing to come off mute and just read the question? And then I'll have somebody else read the task. Who'd volunteer for us?
I'll
Mr.
go.
Jimenez, a 6th grade science teacher, teaches a diverse group of 24 students. 8 of Mr. Jimenez's students read at a 4th grade level and often need instructional support in reading informational materials. 6 students are proficient in fluently reading and comprehending the science text and curriculum-based printed materials. The remaining 10 students are reading more than 2 years below grade level and have significant difficulty in reading the science textbook with fluency. These students struggle in particular with decoding, understanding the meaning of unfamiliar content-specific words, and recalling what they have read.
All right, thank you. And somebody else for the task, please. Task number 1.
Based on information given in the scenario above, identify and describe 2 specific ways that Mr. Jimenez can group students that would best address their specific needs. Be sure to include your response, the benefit of each grouping practice in further developing students' literacy skills related to science instruction.
Okay, so what are we looking for? If somebody is going to get a 3 because they are answering every part of the question, what's the first thing that we want to make sure that we're doing, or they would want to make sure that they're doing? What's the first thing based on the task?
Breaking, yeah, so I see there are 3 different levels in his class. There are like 10 students that are reading below 2 years below, and then there are other students that are fluent in their reading and comprehending. So I'm thinking of identifying and describe 2 specific ways that Mr. Venice can group students.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm guessing separating the groups.
Mm-hmm. So you're correct. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that we can identify 2 ways that we can group the students. So that's what somebody who's responding to this question would want to do. What are 2 ways that we can group these students, identify it, and describe it is the second thing. So first identify, which really means name it, and then describe it. And what's the third thing that we want to make sure we do based off this task? In that last sentence. Okay, the last sentence says,
The
go ahead.
benefit,
The
the benefit of
benefit,
grouping them.
the benefit. So when we're getting ready to look at some sample responses, and we'll guess at where we think they fall on the rubric, whether they be a 3, a 2, or a 1. We'll guess at that. You're looking to see if all of the candidates identified, described the groups, and then gave the benefit of the grouping practice. So let us move into our first example response. Now, at the top, it says sample response, strong, basic, or weak. So a strong response would be a 3, a basic response would be a 2, a weak response would be a 1. So, and I highlighted also what we want to keep in mind: 2 specific ways to group the students and the benefit of each grouping practice. So let's get somebody to read, a volunteer to read this sample response and tell where you think it falls.
Mr. Jimenez has many students who are reading at different levels. He should teach skills students need to read science materials to the whole class. Mr. Jimenez should talk to other teachers in his school to get new ideas about how to teach students who don't have the same reading skills.
Okay, do we think this is a strong response 3, basic response 2, weak response 1? All right, I'm seeing ones, I'm seeing weak. Okay, why? What's one reason why this would be a weak response or a 1?
He's not in like individually
They don't
breaking
wanna
up
go
the
into
groups.
detail of what, the practice and.
So we're definitely, I know I heard a couple of voices, but what I think I'm hearing you say is he's not discussing at all how he would break the students up, or she is not discussing how to break the students up. And then there's no benefit. So, first of all, we're not grouping the students. We don't see evidence of that. So it's not being identified, it's not being described, and then we're not giving the benefit. All right. So, yes, and you're correct in that. This would be a score of a 1 because it does not address any part of the task. Another reason why this is a 1 is I told you that this response actually had, not response, but the question had 2 parts. So this person did better with the second part of the task. That's why they received the score of a 1. If there was no part 2 and they didn't address anything, it would have been a 0. All right, let's go to that next one. Next sample response. Love a volunteer to read. Don't be scared. I know it's a little lengthy. Don't be scared. Let's get a volunteer. No? Okay, I'll do it. One grouping practice that Mr. Jimenez can implement in the classroom is to create several heterogeneous small groups of 4 to 6 students, each of which are comprised of a mix of the 8 students reading at the 4th grade level and the 6 students who are proficient at reading materials in science. The students in each small mixed ability group can work cooperatively as a team in completing a content based assignment with guided support from Mr. Jimenez. In this grouping structure, all students can benefit from having shared responsibility in coordinating the work, completing a task together, and learning from each other. A second grouping structure that Mr. Jimenez can use to meet the needs of diverse students in his classroom is through implementing a jigsaw model. In this grouping practice, for example, Mr. Jimenez can select a current scientific article with the readability level slightly higher than students' reading level, break the information into sections, and ask each of the 6 students with proficient reading skills in the group to learn a section and then teach the information to other group members. This grouping strategy allows each group member to be challenged, become an expert in certain areas, assume responsibility for teaching others, and improve the listening and communication of all group members. All right, let's hear strong response 3, basic response 2, weak response 1. All right, so far looks like we're all in agreement here. It is a strong response. So in this task, this is the commentary from that study companion. The test taker identifies and thoroughly describes 2 grouping practices intended to meet the needs of a diverse student population. And then they name them: forming heterogeneous groups and grouping students through the use of a jigsaw model. The benefits of each grouping structure is also appropriately and clearly identified in the response. And last, sample response. Can I get a volunteer? Not as wordy as the last one.
Mr. Jimenez teaches a class with a wide range of student strengths and weaknesses. One strategy he can use to group students for instruction is to implement peer tutoring groups. In this technique, the teacher can assign a student with problems comprehending scientific concepts with a higher performing student. Together, the pair can work together to successfully complete an assigned task. This strategy gives extra support and guidance to the lower performing student in learning difficult content, and it helps the higher performing student in reinforcing his or her learning and assuming responsibility for aiding a peer. Mr. Jimenez can also use flexible grouping to meet his students' specific learning needs. Based on current classroom assessments, he can organize students into small groups on a temporary basis.
All right, thank you. So what do we think? Strong 3, basic 2, weak 1. Okay, looks like we're in agreement here with the 2, and let's see why. In task 1, the test taker identifies 2 ways Mr. Jimenez can group students for instruction based on their specific needs. He mentions peer tutoring groups and flexible grouping. The sample provides a description of each technique, but does not provide an explanation of the benefit of flexible grouping. So, had they added that benefit to the flexible grouping part of the response, then yes, they could have had a 3, but we failed to do that. What are your thoughts so far? What are your thoughts after looking at these responses, sample responses? What do you know you want to make sure you're doing when responding to a constructed response item?
Answering and explaining all parts of the text.
All parts. That's a big deal. Anybody else?
Yeah, expanding on that, just not picking and choosing what parts of the question you want to answer.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're looking for certain wordage too, to come up with your comment at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Say a little bit more about that when you say they're looking for certain wordage.
Like the score of 3, just the way that was written,
Mm-hmm.
it's so like it answers everything, but I think there are certain words that they're looking for, like implementing a jigsaw model. Like I wouldn't think of writing that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you have to go into these questions knowing certain instructions, strategies.
Yeah. So if we go back to that scoring guide, they want to know that you are aware of the elements of reading and reading instruction, and that you have relevant knowledge of certain concepts, theories, facts, procedures, and methodologies. So, yes, you're right. Some of that should show up in your writing because it proves that you have the knowledge that's necessary. They're giving you a scenario about specific student needs or about class needs, and you're showing I have relevant knowledge that would help to support these students or this classroom. So yes, that was a valid point. Anybody else? Okay, so here is, and I should have changed this. It says your term. And I don't want us to be hesitant about this. I want you to have 5 minutes because you're only actually responding to one task and not two. I want you to take 5 minutes with this same exact prompt, and I want you to just jot down what you think your responses would be. You don't have to make it a full paragraph just for today's purposes, but what 2 strategies would you identify, strategies for grouping? How would you describe those groupings, and what benefits would you say would be part of the grouping practice? So it's the same one. Mr. Jimenez has this diverse group, and based on the information, describe 2 specific groups and give the benefits. Identify, describe benefits. Let's take 5 minutes to work on that, and then we'll talk in 5 minutes. All right, a little less than 2 minutes. All right, let's get ready to do some quick sharing. I would like to hear, just call them out or put them in the chat. Let's start by identifying ways to group the students. So if you had a way to name those groupings, what would you say? What are some other ways to group students? Call some things out or put something in the chat.
In my response, I was saying that I would, so there were 6 students who were proficiently reading. I would divide those and have 2 of those students go into the group of students reading at a 4th grade reading level. So they would be able to provide peer instruction in helping clarify some of their questions on the reading informational materials prior to like the teacher being able to be in that small group. And
Okay.
then the other 4 students, I would have them in the group of 10 that are 2 years below grade level, and
Mm-hmm.
they would basically be serving the same purpose, and they'll be able to engage in cooperative learning and answering questions and hearing their thinking process of how they are dissecting the text in decoding and understanding, because in the real teaching world, it's only one of you. And whenever you have more students that are a little bit higher or on grade level, it's
Mm-hmm.
to your advantage to use them to help be some of your hands in instructing and clarifying information in those groups. And
Okay.
so that's how I would split them up. And then just helping them maybe create like some type of word bank, words that they are struggling to understand. And then as a teacher, you can go to each group and then dissect those words and help them understand the actual meaning of those words, and then go back and reread or do a share read with them.
Okay. So, what I hear happening or benefit that I hear in your explanation of the grouping practice that you would use is that the students would have an opportunity to learn from each other. So, not just the teacher, but they're able to get some peer feedback. That's a
Mhm.
benefit that I heard coming out of the grouping structures that you said you would use. What are some other grouping structures that you think would be relevant for a response to task number one?
I would just say again, breaking them up in among, within 2 groups, homogeneous, similar achievement levels.
Okay.
And then, everyone will be able to perform at their own pace with peers that are on the same level. And then the other level, which would be heterogeneous, different achievement levels. So the expectations for students would be the same,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but I didn't go into full detail, just giving like an idea of how I would split them up.
Okay. Okay. Are there any other grouping practices that are different from what we've heard? We heard about allowing students to pretty much learn from their peers in all of these different structures. It could be homogeneous, it could be heterogeneous. Are there any other grouping practices that you think would be relevant to a response for this question?
I would typically utilize the students reading on similar ability levels. If
Okay.
you group the class that way, the students who are on reading on grade level would be able to read more independently, which means the teacher can push those students into more independent learning. And then the students who are below reading level, they would get more touch points from the teacher, or at the school that I'm at, we have a 2-teacher model in every classroom. So one teacher would be solely focusing on those students and getting them more comfortable with the text, whether that be reading aloud to them or partner reading with some of them. That way those students become more successful, or they feel more successful with the materials because they're already behind. And then with those other students, they're still being pushed and not necessarily being grouped with those students to move them further ahead, so they're not feeling as stagnant, if that makes sense.
Okay, and we have one response in the chat. I would group students. This is similar to something we've heard. I would group students based on abilities. Ability grouping would give them work at their current ability level. And a benefit would be that the students that need more intensive support are getting extra attention. So, again, to respond to this question appropriately, we would want to identify and describe 2 ways that Mr. Jimenez could group the students, and then we would want to make sure that we're sharing the benefit of each grouping practice. So if we're doing all of that and all of it shows our knowledge of reading and reading instruction, especially specific to this context, then we can expect a score of a 3 for that. So we're at our time right now. I'd love to hear 1 or 2 reflections, and we'll close out next Saturday, same time. We would pretty much follow the same process, but we'd have different questions for each section of the test and a different task for the constructed response. So, reflections or takeaways, what will you take with you?
Read the question carefully to make sure that you get, they give you scratch paper, so like maybe write down the points of what they want, so make sure you get them in your responses.
Thank you, Mike. One other?
For the score of a 3 for the strong and well supported part, are they looking for you to go, I guess, more relevant like citations for that backup response?
When you say
Or
citations,
does it have to be more so of what you've learned, to give a response to back up what you're saying?
you just want, I don't know that you need to cite anything. When you say cite, do
Okay.
you mean like maybe reference somebody in the field of reading, or reference, is that what you're talking about, like referencing
Right.
research? So
Yes.
you don't have to refer to research. Your response just needs to show that it is relevant, like it's actually answering the question. And while you're answering the question about let's go back to the question we just used about a grouping practice, like that's a part of supporting students in their reading and development, is knowing how to group them. So how would you
Okay.
group them? They want to know what your knowledge is about that. And
Okay.
then when you're grouping, you should be grouping with a purpose. And that's why they asked you about the benefits. So they're really looking for your knowledge while you are addressing the prompt. So you're not having to cite, but you are showing them, I do know about how to support students in their reading and writing development as it relates to this scenario. And here's my response.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, I have enjoyed being with you. Thank you so much for your engagement. And perhaps I will see you next week, Saturday. And you have a good one.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye. You're welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you.